Hi, welcome back to another coding challenge video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the problem called dynamic array from HackerRank, and we're going to be doing it in C#. So this one's a little bit trickier than some of my previous videos. Has like an 83% success rate. I think that's mostly because the problem statement is not very clear at all. Definitely took me a minute to even realize what they were trying to ask, so do my best to try and paraphrase what's going on here. First, we're going to be making a list of integers, and then we are going to be given queries, two different queries. The first query is going to be inserting things into our list of lists. The second thing is going to be retrieving things from our list of lists. And we're going to be keeping track of everything we retrieve. And at the end, we're going to be returning everything that we retrieved. So, a little bit more to it than that. You can see there's some pretty weird symbols going on here. So this is actually, we're not going to just be inserting like at the end of the list every time. It's going to be calculated, the index that we're going to be inserting to and retrieving from is going to be calculated each time based on two things. The first thing it's going to be based on is this thing called last answer. So initially that's set to 0, and then everything we retrieve after that is going to take the place of last answer. The second thing it's dependent on is x, which is one of the parameters given to us in our queries. And then n, which stands for the number of lists that we're going to be managing. So that's, oh, and I guess I should explain, this symbol right here is the exclusive or bitwise operation. Not going to talk too much about that. I honestly don't think bitwise is that important unless you're going to be doing some low-level coding like, I don't know, operating systems, embedded systems, firmware engineers, stuff like that. So let's look at query 2 really quick. So it's going to start with a 2, and we're going to be getting an x and a y as parameters. And then we're going to be calculating the same index to see which list we're working on. And then we're going to be retrieving the element, or I should say the value of the element at y mod size, size being the length, the count of whatever list we're working on. Okay, so let's take a look at the constraints. N and Q, N being the number of lists we're going to be dealing with, and Q being the number of queries we're going to be dealing with, are going to be between 1 and 10 to the 5th. Next, we have X and Y, which are our query parameters, which are going to be between 0 and 10 to the 9th. And then finally, they say it's guaranteed that query type 2 will never query an empty sequence or index. That's coming from this section right here, or I guess mostly talking about this section right here. Anytime you directly access an array at some random integer, you should be wary of doing that. In C#, I should say. There are other languages that are more forgiving, but in C#, if you access a list or an array outside of its current bounds, then it's going to throw an exception. So it's telling us, don't worry about that. I guarantee that the inputs and the test cases that I give you, that's going to be fine. So that saves us some amount of checking. So let's look at this input file. So we have N and Q right here. N is 2. We're going to be dealing with 2 lists and 5 queries, and then we have the 5 queries. The first thing in the query tells us what type of query it is, 1 being the insert and 2 being the select, if you are familiar with SQL, sort of. Anyways, so then we have our parameters, which correspond and do different things depending on what query we're doing. Okay, so then they have a really long, too long example. We won't be going over that. So let's jump into the code. So first things first, let's work out what we will be returning. So if we look at the return type right here, see, we're going to be returning a list of integers. If you remember, I said that this is going to be every time we retrieve something, every time we select something from our list of lists, we're going to be holding on to that, and at the end, that's what we're going to be returning. So we'll just call this final answers, and we'll set that to a new blank list, and we will return that at the end. Okay. So what other variables do we need? Well, we need something to hold the last answer. Hold on one second. I'm actually going to change this to last answers. Okay, so we need something to hold the first last answer. Last answer plays a part in the index calculation, so we need that to be initialized to something. And then after that, everything that we retrieve will take its place. So last but not least, we need to make our sequence list, which will be a list of integers. And we'll call that sequence list. And set that to a new list of integers. Okay, next we need to add a new list to sequence list for as many n's that we have. So let's make a simple for loop, which will go from 0 to n. And then for every time we pass through this list, we'll add a new list to our sequence list. And a blank one, no values initially. So now we have pretty much all the setup. So now we're going to go over each query and do what it says. So let's make a for each loop, and we'll say for each query in queries, we want to do the following. So if you notice, both queries use the same index calculation. So we might as well do that before we check which query we're on, because we know both of them use it. And that kind of avoids having duplicate code if we were to calculate that index within each query. So we'll say int index, and we can pretty much just copy that formula straight over. So x is going to be the first parameter, which is going to be the second thing in query. Query, remember, is a list of integers. Queries is a list of int. So query will be just a list of int. So we'll be looking for the second thing in query, that will be x. So query at the second thing, and then this gets exclusive ORed, which is in C# the caret operator, or whatever that thing is technically called. Not really sure. And then we want it to be exclusive ORed with last answer. We'll get rid of this extra set of parentheses, and then finally we will mod it with n. Oops, mod. Okay, so next thing we need to do is we need to check which query we're running. And that is determined by looking at the first thing in query and seeing if it's 1 or 2. So if query first is equal to a 1, then we'll handle query 1 there. And if it's not, then we'll handle query 2. So if it's query 1, we'll look over here. It says calculate the index, basically, which we've already done. And then whatever sequence is at that index, we're going to be appending y to it. Y being the last parameter in query that we are given. So we'll say our seq list at our index. That's going to be the sequence that we're working on. And then we'll say add y, which is query dot last. Dot last and dot first, if you're wondering. So dot first is pretty much the same thing as doing this. I just hate looking at that, so I just say dot first. Dot first and dot last are coming from link. All right, so that's it for that one. Query 2, we need to we need to calculate which, so query 2, if you remember, is going to be retrieving a value from some list. And the list we're going to be looking at is sequence list at index. That part doesn't change from query 1. But then we need to figure out which element that we retrieve. Unfortunately, it doesn't say just retrieve the last one or the first one. It says retrieve whatever one's at y mod size. So to avoid a really long, complicated line, let's set up a variable for y. So y is going to be our second parameter in the query. So query dot last. And then let's set up one for size, which will be whatever sequence list we're looking at, we want the count of that. So yes, I know it gets confusing. Which one are we talking about? Size, count, length. Seems like all these data structures in different languages have the same name for the different name for the same thing. So in this case, we're dealing with the list, which is given by count. So after we have that, then we want to set final score to whatever that element is. So sequence list at index and then at y mod size. Some spaces around that. And finally, last but not least, we want to say final scores add, wait, is it called final scores or last answer? I've been getting these mixed up. Okay, so this final score is actually last answer. I have no idea where I was pulling final scores from. So last answers add last answer. Because if you remember, everything we retrieve, we want to keep track of that because that's what we're going to be returning. All right, so let's go ahead and run this and see if we made any syntax errors or spelling mistakes. Looks good. Let's match it up against all the other test cases. Cool, that's it for this one. Hope you found it informative. Thanks for watching.